Chapter 6, After Modernity. Quoting Samuel Beckett's Endgame, Ham anguished, "What's happening? What's happening?" Clove, "Something is taking its course." The age of the epilogue. In recent times, the prefix after has made a noteworthy career for itself. Hardly any article or feature supplement would be considered up to date without it. In the form of the Latin post, more recent cultural criticism is speckled with it. It emits a flare of elegant reflexivity. It suggests that something is happening because something else is over. Its property includes a consciousness that has seen many worlds come and go, including those that wanted to become a beautiful new one. Used correctly, the prefix pushes the past away as if it were a position that has become untenable. In one sentence, it jumps into a present that can always claim to come after the past. We do not know much of this past, and yet it is a unique feeling to have it be behind us. A small after, and world ages become outdated. Post-modernity. It has a strange ring to it. Never before did somebody give such a cold goodbye to yesterday. With just one prefix, you are ahead of your epoch. What does this tell us? The career of the prefix after suggests that although shocking things happen, we no longer have a conception of history at our disposal that would allow the present to date itself. Since the general impression that history has no roadmap is spreading, we feel our way forward through a processual no man's land. The unleashed reality seems to be neither communicable nor predictable. Never mind the idea of subsuming them under a historico-philosophical schema. And no specific epoch name seems to fit the present either. We can't even clearly distinguish epochs and trends. You might get the impression that the matter of reality is itself changing and evaporating into something unimaginable. For this reason, postmodernity cannot be the term for an epoch with any kind of claim to historico-philosophical materiality, because only an index for increases in reflection. But only an index for... For this reason, postmodernity cannot be the term for an epoch with any kind of claim to historico-philosophical materiality, but only an index for increases in reflection. But what increases with this reflection is only the sobering effect of contemplation, nothing more. Postmodern reflexivity does not lead to peaks where a self-made and self-satisfied consciousness can look down onto its age, having made the climb. Expansive views, cross-sections, panoramas. Who wouldn't like them? And with them the ecstasy of the broad context, the summit experience that can capture its age and thought. But when thinking goes about its task today, it is not in the mood for summit expeditions. It remains completely post-conceptual and post-culminating. It abstains from the old ascension fantasies that would have us characterize the processes in social and logical reality with progressive alpine metaphors. Process and progress only have a deceptive rhyme in common, and postmodernity does not set much in store for it. Sure, we continue to advance, but not upward. That is the quintessence of post-progressive reflections on the relationship between mind and time. And this confirms that pre-modern spirits are also to be found in the post-modern hustle and bustle, for whom the Wheel of Fortune makes far more sense as a symbol for historic time than a ladder of progress. Those who live later do not know better. This fact marks the end of the historical experiment that wanted to force the truth to increasingly stand out over time. What has really emerged in the course of the experiment is precisely that it is by no means certain that a later knowledge is the better one. Postmodern feelings of process are not those of people that believe that they are going uphill historically. They are more likely to be the sensations of passers-by on an escalator, where you make automatic progress, whether you abide by the rule to stand on the right or to walk on the left. As long as you are on the escalator, it constantly proceeds forward in one direction. But comparing an escalator with the idea of progress would be an over-interpretation, to say the least. The spatial and kinetic metaphors of the old Enlightenment no longer belong here, and the concept of ascension is also unsuitable for marking location differences on escalators. If one rolls down, the other rolls further up. The distance between the two has no evolutionary purpose and cannot translate into a leading edge for the top-rolling one, even if it seems to be the one that has gotten further to the quote-unquote height of the age, whose high position amounts to being here and now and nothing else. Ever since progress has become automatic, optimism about the future has transformed into process melancholy. We are no longer driving out of Genoa into modernity. We are rolling on a conveyor belt into the unpredictable. Our own movement hardly counts compared to the total bulk of movement, and the steps that the individual can take on their section of the escalator disappear almost without trace in the rolling whole. Furthermore, although no one knows where the escalator leads, it's hard to suppress the thought that even the longest conveyor belt must eventually end and throw its passengers off. Since all this has become entrenched into a modern order of things, briefings on the escalator have become a mass necessity. One has to fear that today's cultural enterprise is no longer much more than the sum of the intellectual hobbies of escalator riders. Even these hobbies are now so imbued with their own automatism that it makes little difference whether someone moves affirmatively or critically on this escalator. Indeed, one can even move revolutionarily. There has been no effective difference between the movement of the escalator and the cultural manifestations on it for a long time now, because the field of culture as a market of differences is itself entirely organised like an escalator. Through its motor activity, the things of yesterday are constantly de-actualised. From the gesture of de-actualisation itself, a new actuality is launched and already overthrown in its design stage, one volatility chasing the other. The gesture that corresponds to continuous operations is that of the obituary. It is the dominant form of expression of a culture that lives entirely on the game of current de-actualisation. For this reason, the post of postmodernism primarily means the after of obituary. No form of speech is as adequate to the principle of escalator culture as the obituary, which, in the midst of permanent movement and chronic ambiguity, recalls the last sure fact: the past is not the present. In a time and place where no one can know what will happen tomorrow, it seems almost like a gift that at least the past is over. It therefore provides a criterion that weathers storms. Contemporary culture is a large machine that emits epilogues and creates a hint of orientation in the present by suspending the past. Contemporary brains are, at the moment, still warm from the iteration of the last epilogic surges. This entire post-Freudian, post-Marxist, post-structuralist, post-metaphysical rhetoric with which the respective speakers appeared to be at the highest level of possibility for 15 minutes. The more violent the deformation of the past, the sooner a space for new settlements opens up in the present, even if it is only an illusion of space. For the citizens of escalators, only the epilogic overtaking of the latest trend can achieve the coveted contemporary ecstasy, without which no modern generation can stand itself. As if under duress, the glance falls backwards. by no means forwards, where the journey of the conveyor belt would show that it leads into hopelessness. We prefer to have modernity behind us rather than the eternity of the escalator in front. To cavort in the postmodern rather than in the purgatory of a unitary civilization. To stand at the open grave of the age of progress, then before that turn into the future that economic advisors want to talk us into. For contemporary consciousness, death no longer means the impossibility of having a project, as Levinas once put it, but the impossibility of giving an excuse. It may be that we do not take it far with such speeches, but with its epilogic genius, the much maligned postmodernism reaches an optimum of the presently possible mental states in spite of everything. For this is just the way that it is. Every incoherent dreamer creates programs, but epilogues require a modicum of awareness and a sense of context. Additionally, the after comes from the after of after-school detention, where we only too often have to stay to make up the missed lessons of modernity. There are reasons to believe that for a large majority of contemporaries a substantial modernity has not yet occurred, and that it could only arrive in the form of making up and reviewing. Moreover, a lot of suspect figures can be seen spooking around at the moment, wanting to skip a grade directly into postmodernism from the Bushes or the Biedermeier, without getting to know even a little bit of modernity in between. They will show where the postmodern times might have enough class and forming power to make the new Bushmen sit down for detention. The after of after-modernism has yet another meaning that extends past that of the epilogue and the obituary. The obituary and the declaration of the death of yesterday are not enough. At least within a dark corner of their consciousness, everyone knows that the automatism of the world process conceals perspectives other than just the quote-unquote and so on of the obedient escalator. There is also something catastrophic and unparalleled with which the escalator only has automatism in common, but otherwise propels us forward with a completely different type of movement. We are subjective elements plugged into a historico-planetary chain reaction that we called history in its relatively slow phase, and which now seems to be running right to the point of explosion. What we would have to say in view of such threatening things does not seem to be an epilogue, but a prognosis, because we are talking about a catastrophe that has been going on for a long time, whose biggest blows are yet to come. In truth, this prognosis is the most radical form of eulogy, namely a prophetic epilogic that obits to us from a location after annihilation, letting us know what will be said about us then. Thus, the current apocalyptic breaks through the wall of time, and, as if from the other side of fate, talks about the events on this side of the wall. This results not only in an anticipatory epilogue on humanity, but also in the very strange sense that the speakers must think of themselves as dead in order to take the point of view from which they will tell the truth. The after of postmodernism reveals itself here as the after of self-indulgence, with which a civilization, convinced of its untenability, gives itself an account of its prospects. The Enlightenment is completed in the coincidence of prognosis and obituary, culminating in an absolute necrology that overtakes every possible future, and now already pronounces doom as the last word of knowledge. That is why the present, which examines its future perspective, is forced to speak of itself in a tragic future tense, and deliver its own eulogies ahead of time, because there will be no other speakers to do it in due course. Aren't most animal films today already obituaries to animals? Eulogies for entire species? Does anthropology thus turn into a zoology of the necrological animal? This is where an unforeseen after comes into play. It belongs to an awareness that has the aforementioned self-eulogies behind it, at least in the sense that it has heard and understood them and yet cannot stop there. Obviously, even the most routine pessimism is limited to the fact that bad predictions travel faster than bad events. Before they arrive, the observation that we still exist, in spite of everything, remains true. Even premature obituaries do not change the fact that new days are dawning until further notice, as fragile and as temporary as all previous ones. The waking spirit sometimes survives the red-hot despair at its own finiteness. Set against a background of downfalls, our stay in the temporary act of the real starts to become strangely cheerful. The worries translucent, the uncertainties self-confident. Perhaps adulthood was never anything other than an encrypted word for what comes after despair. We are still breathing. The sun is still rising. We still learn the most important thing from the day in the main news. The last days are still hidden. The apocalypse is being put on the shelf for now to join the other unsightly literature. The black tailcoat for humanity's funeral stays in the closet. The eschaton shows patience. This post-desperate life resembles carelessness to a T and differs from blindness only in barely noticeable details. We say postmodernism with a misunderstood smile, as if we knew that it should be called still modernism. If we were to characterize the specific structure of contemporary life, we would come up with the concept of an interim that is after the prognosis of the worst and before the verification of the predictions by the actual. There is no more appropriate term for such a situation than that of the interim. However, our interim does not have a precise deadline, but leaves the day, hour, and cause of the disaster open. Because of this, life too can set itself up and spread out within the extended interim as if it were safe. It is only in the ambiguity of the interim that hope finds its playing field. That is why hope is not a principle, but a secondary product of uncertainty about the bad outcome of history. While hope has become effective as a history-making force, its effects are borrowed from eschatology and the inaccuracy of our knowledge about the limits of the interim. This explains why the word hope must not be writ large either now or in the future. Its real place is behind the scenes, and its appropriate key is pianissimo. Only Bloch was allowed to raise his voice on the subject of hope because, unbeknownst to him, he wrote its obituary, the only legitimate occasion to transfigure an effect into a principle. Moreover, loud talk about hope is nowadays just cynical fabrication. Those who want to wage aggressive hope campaigns belong in the neighbourhood of the leading German columnist who was supposed to have said after Chernobyl, "Life is distasteful, it just keeps going." The same can be said of the hope that is rightly claimed to belong to life. The only thing that helps hope in its macabre alliance with this obstinately continuing life is unyielding discretion. In the future, we must place private hopes under confessional secrecy and threaten prison sentences for public hope. Those who actually have hopes should bury them as deep as they can, for they can only be helpful as silent forces. Only as such do they not get mixed up with those series of causes that lead to catastrophe. This is the only way in which they do not contribute to the mobilization of enterprises against one's better judgment. Only thus will they become forces of life, doing their work behind individuals' backs and carrying them over the abysses above which the worlds of daylight have been erected.